Hello everyone, my name's Stephen Redman and welcome to another episode of Pastor's Library. This is the channel where we talk about everything to do with theology books, books that may have a place on a reading list, at a seminary course, at a bachelor's or master's degree in theology or in biblical studies, or simply books that have piqued your interest because you've seen them on your very own pastor's desk or perhaps in a bookstore. Today we're going to talk about a subject that I have had a number of requests about. If you like what I have to say today, then please give us a thumbs up on YouTube. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. Please click on the bell. It will help the algorithm to popularise our channel, and we do appreciate your support most sincerely. So, I think it must be about 6 months ago now, the first person emailed me and said, I'd like to get your view on the new perspective of Paul. I said, I'll look into it and I'll get back to you, thinking I just need to sort of solidify what I see as my own views on this. And of course, realistically, I think what's very, very important for all of us is that we are able to read outside, not necessarily in our comfort zone. I think we have to be able to read a view that may not necessarily coincide with our own or that of our local church. So I think personally it's very important that we do not think that reading an opposite opinion is a sin, but by reading an opposite opinion, we may not only remain teachable before God, but that we may be able to solidify and firm up our own internal arguments for why indeed we do believe what we do believe. I don't think that I have ever been a person who could read something and be instantly put off what I had believed to that point. I think it's really important that we listen to contrary positions and can stake our claim for why we believe them or we believe the position we had already taken. And in my life, I have certainly made some seismic shifts, and I thank God for my ability to read, and I thank God for my ability to read and the help that has been to me to find my way through. Ultimately, I do not consider that my own opinions are beyond reproach. I do not believe that I have it all right. I often say when talking about the book of Revelation that when I was 18, I fully understood that book. What's more, I could argue my case, and when I was 30, I realised that I didn't know what the book of Revelation was really going on about, and I ought to shut up. When I was 40, I was recognising that people were saying to me, Steve, why don't you teach on the book of Revelation? It'd be good to have a series on it. And I thought, well, I probably need to start doing the reading that will help me with this. By the time I was 50, I felt that I was ready to preach through the book of Revelation. And now I am in my mid-60s. I feel I am much more able to communicate something of what the Bible teaches about the great book of Revelation. Am I right? Well, I think I have the thrust of modern theology at my side backing me up. But ultimately, I think that it's important that I have been open to ideas during this time and have prayerfully asked the Holy Spirit to lead and direct me. I am certainly very comfortable with my position. Now, what I've described to you has taken a lot of years, and I have used what is a fairly extreme example, the book of Revelation. But in all of these things, it's important that we are listening to God. I do remember taking a very extreme position with God once and saying, Lord, don't let anybody else teach me anything different because I know I am right. And, realistically, I think that in itself is an inherently indefensible position. So, the new perspective on Paul. Well, it got called that quite quickly, but the people behind it would argue that it wasn't necessarily that new, and they would argue that it is a perspective on Paul, and the more traditional perspective on Paul isn't an old perspective, it's just a more traditional one. So where does it all start? Where does it creep in from? Well, there are a few names that I could drop, but I'm going to miss a couple of them out and mention Christa Stendhal, who in this book, Paul Among Jews and Gentiles, puts a few essays together which include his remarkable essay, The Apostle Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West. This book was printed in 1976. I think that the chapter in particular that I'm referring to was probably originally a speech to a group in 1963. And what Stendhal does here is he demonstrates that even then there was a tide gathering against the traditional Lutheran Augustinian view that had been adopted in the early part of the Reformation on the interpretation of the role of the law in Judaism. Remember that Luther is facing a time in medieval Germany when Judaism is frowned upon widely, and of course many of you will know the criticism of Luther for what might be described as anti-Semitic views. But as you read this, what you will see is there's clearly a move in the middle to latter half of the 20th century. Well, it's not even the latter half, is it? It's quite just after the middle. And that Stendhal here demonstrates there are some differences. Those differences most strongly seen in a book called Paul and Palestinian Judaism by E.P. Sanders. Now, Sanders has been a great theologian of our time and has written some really, really good books. But this is the book that really seals his teaching, covenantal nomism. Now, can I just say that nomism has no G in it, just in case you are wondering. What covenantal nomism really is teaching is that you don't enter God's covenant by obedience to a set of laws, and belonging cannot be earned. It is by the grace of God, and obedience, the virtue of obedience, is one of maintaining one's status within that covenant. And that covenant has to do with relationship. So really, what Sanders is talking about is observances rather than general good works. What he's saying is that things like circumcision and the dietary laws of Judaism and other items, these made a marked difference between Jews and Gentiles. And this obedience to the law was more to do with identity than it was to do with earning salvation. And we could go into that now for another hour, but we haven't really got time on this. But that's really where Sanders is going. And I have to say, this book is an excellent read. Let me see, my copy was printed in 1977. So that's quite a while ago now, but it's still a bit of a classic. Now, the person that is largely credited with coining the phrase "a new perspective on Paul" is James D.G. Dunn. Now, this book the New Perspective on Paul Revised Edition, which is a lovely tome, and it hits James Dunn at the peak, really, of his writing. He produces here a whole number of essays which are very, very helpful. This was published in 2005. It's by William Erdman's Grand Rapids. And what you'll find in this book, an introduction that leads you into the New Perspective on Paul, and the second chapter in this book, which is simply called The New Perspective on Paul 1983, is really the summary of his initial position, which was called by the theological world the New Perspective. Now, here's an excerpt from page 21 of this book. It says, "From the first, my concern has been not to attack or deny the classic Christian doctrine of justification by faith. My concern has always been that the doctrine of justification, as rediscovered or reasserted by Luther, and as consistently expounded within Protestantism, has neglected important aspects, particularly of Paul's original formulation, in the context of his mission. In the Justice of God essay, I protest against the corollary of the traditional exposition that Paul affirmed his doctrine against a degenerate Jewish legalism." And it goes on from that. And I suppose what is often said about New Perspective teachers is that they are putting aside grace, they're putting aside justification or redefining justification. But I'm not sure that they are doing that. But what I do think they're doing is they're getting us to consider a wider view and to understand that maybe the traditional view, which is clearly a Protestant reformational view, that the traditional view might be more anti-Catholic in its arguments than biblical in its arguments. Please understand, I'm not coming down particularly one way or the other today, but what I'm trying to say is that I think is very important to his writing. What I think is essential here is that we don't take a distinct black and white view on all matters of biblical interpretation, but we must be prepared to read and listen to ensure the teachability of our own hearts. That quote, incidentally, is by someone who I have listened to quite a lot. Oh, okay, I wrote it. But the thing is that black and white is not necessarily all that there is. Sometimes there is white with a spot of grey in it. Sometimes there is black with a spot of grey in it. And I think we sometimes have to understand that it doesn't have to be all one way or all the other. Sometimes there are, I don't like the word compromised views, but there are views that bridge the gap. And sometimes we need to expose ourselves to those views and understand that that's the case. So James Dunn here, this New Perspective on Paul, is really excellent. He also wrote a book called Jesus, Paul and the Law, which has a similar outlook to this book. This book, I would suggest, has got items from that brought in. And so probably if you have this, you don't need Jesus, Paul and the Law. But Jesus, Paul and the Law will definitely show you where his thinking comes from. And I think the late James Dunn's thought process, the theology that he wrote, is excellent. And whether or not you sign up to his position on this, I would suggest that's down to you. And you should read and see what you think. But whatever you think about the process, I think James Dunn's commitment to it is self-evident. And this book, which is 539 pages, is a great commitment to the concept of a different perspective. And it's really a good place to start. Now, a lot of people will just say, well, you haven't mentioned Tom Wright yet. No, I'm about to. But actually, by the time Tom Wright is on this, James Dunn has put it mainly into words, and he has worked basically on Sanders' ideas, and we've got to the point of having this new perspective fully described. Tom Wright then gives it his touch, and we get some greater clarity, and we get some books written about it. For example, what St. Paul really said. The cover of mine says, "Was Paul of Tarsus the real founder of Christianity?" But this book has a section on justification and the church, and that section is really very clear in regards N.T. Wright's thinking on the new perspective. So this book, which is not terribly expensive, I mean, it's only 192 pages. This version was published in 1997. This book, which is quite affordable, would give you a lot of insight into where N.T. Wright is on this argument. Also, his book Justification, God's Plan and Paul's Vision, is the subtitle, which was published in 2009. This one talks in depth about N.T. Wright's position on justification and has a lot of reflection on the new perspective. Now, what I think is really important here is justification. People will say this is the big issue between the traditional perspective and the new perspective. No, actually that isn't correct. The real issue is righteousness. Righteousness, according to the reformers, and they had a bit of good reason to argue this, because they were living in a day when you could buy righteousness for a few coins from a priest in the form of a scroll which you could take with you, and you could be killed in the Crusades and you could be guaranteed you were forgiveness because he had it in writing. These people were coming out of that position, and what the new perspective is stating really is that righteousness is not a moral state. It's not a condition that you are in morally. It is about your right standing with God. And that means it's a relational thing. For example, in the New Beacon Bible commentary, they handle this so well in the 2-volume commentary on Romans. And I really, really like that. Because ultimately, I would describe myself as having a relational theology, but by that I don't mean an American relational theology that, for example, Tom Ord would sign up to, because I don't recognise that. But I'm talking about a British relational theology, the sort that would be described by Roger Forster, for example. And I think it's very important that we see that righteousness is about the standing we have before God, which Christ has given us. It's free, it's not earned, and in that sense I would be a Lutheran, an Augustine in the something, but I do not sign up to the sort of God that Augustine signed up to, rooted in his thinking of the day, the philosophy of Greece and Rome. But I really see God as being a God of love, a God who really is agape, a God who is there to build relationship with his covenant people. And I think that that's the God of the Bible. Now, if you accept Dunn's position on righteousness, then that leads you to a greater understanding of all the other terms that we throw about the ring in our Protestant positions. And I think it's interesting, there's been a certain amount of understanding reached between the Catholic Church and the Protestant denominations in recent years on issues of justification and of salvation by faith. And these points, I think, perhaps have been made possible by the new perspective on Paul. But you see, those people that still maintain that all Catholics should be burnt at the stake, those people don't like a position that would do anything to build bridges with Catholicism. And I do understand that, believe me. I do try to be very understanding, but I have learnt a lot as a card-carrying Pentecostal charismatic. I have learnt a lot from Catholics, and I regularly meet with Catholic priests through our local network of ministers in the city, and whereas some of them have very different positions to me, I have to say the more senior ones, I would say, have very, very similar positions. For example, when my eldest daughter was doing her theology degree, she had a requirement to interview a Catholic on the issue of the Eucharist, the breaking of bread, the Mass, and what was going on with transubstantiation. Well, I went and had a word with my Catholic priest friends in the city, and I said to them, now guys, look, my daughter's doing this. Could you just help us with a few ideas? She's got to answer a question which is basically about transubstantiation. And they burst out laughing. And, I said, well, guys, I love the laughter and I love you both, but you've got to help me here. What are you laughing at? He says, well, it's always down to this, isn't it? We're Catholics. We believe in the literal change of the bread and the wine into the blood and body of Jesus Christ. He said, except we don't know any Catholics that think that way. We believe that a spiritual thing takes place, not a physical thing. We've been walking together for some years, and, I am not eager to go and worship with Catholics. The style doesn't appeal to me, and some of the things still tickle the back of my neck and make the hairs on my arms stand on end when I think of things I was taught when I was a young person in the church about them. I'm not saying I'm a man who's entirely free from discrimination, but I do try to hear other person's side of things. And what I am quite sensitive to, I think, is the willingness of people who want to share Jesus with me, and my sensitivity is to whether or not it's the same Jesus. And I think it's wonderful that people from very, very different perspectives in the Christian church are definitely Christian. I don't believe there's going to be a Pentecostal heaven or a Baptist heaven or a Methodist heaven or an Anglican heaven or a Catholic heaven or any of these other places. I just think those of us who are in the kingdom of God will be together, and we have to learn to come to terms with that somehow and some way. And that doesn't mean compromise. I work very strongly with a local network of leaders of churches and leaders of Christian ministries in the city of York in England. And we are not trying to make one big mess where we all reach the lowest common denominator. We are looking to raise each other up and talk about Jesus and talk about the gospel and the things that we all recognise are true. And whereas I have never been in a church in my life that use the creeds, I would recognise, for example, that the creeds are a fair representation of Christian belief. Someone else who will recognise that too, or will share with me, for example, the statement of belief of the Evangelical Alliance in the UK. These ideas are good ideas and they are good things to share. And whereas I feel I'm slipping off the main point of this video today, realistically, I don't think we have any right just to dismiss people because somebody has told us they have the new perspective on Paul, and we know the traditional one that fathers have believed for centuries. And of course, everybody will say that we've believed this all the way back to Abraham. But the truth is that emphasis on belief is very often contextual to our time, and we haven't necessarily always had that. For example, we could take the view of Calvinistic viewpoint, which we would say Calvin was very Augustinian in his thinking, and we could say, well, this goes back to the great Christian leader Augustine, and yet what happened the 200 or 300 years before him? And you could say, well, Arminius, he was raising the issue of things that were very much more first century. Now, whatever position you take on this, we can all argue that we have the support of Scripture. We can all argue that our understanding and our traditions are better than someone else's. But I think what's really important is that we read, that we are open to teaching, and that ultimately we put Jesus first, and that we have a Trinitarian view, and that in doing all of these things, we are trying to improve our minds and hearts for the sake of the kingdom of God. I think that's probably where I'll stop my preaching for today. But getting back to N.T. Wright, he has this great book called Pauline Perspectives, which are essays on Paul from 1978 to 2013. And this book again has a great deal of emphasis on this issue. For example, he talks about the law in Romans, talks about Paul in Galatians, Paul in Romans. He talks about the shape of justification. He talks about the new perspective on Paul from 2003, understanding the gospel, the righteousness of God, final judgment and justification. And he also talks about redemption from the new perspective. So this book is a great one to get hold of, to look at in-depth ideas that N.T. Wright has. And, once again, I'm not an Anglican. I've never been an Anglican. I don't suppose I ever will be an Anglican. But N.T. Wright is an Anglican, and he has produced some of the best things that I've ever read. I don't agree with everything he writes, because I don't agree with everything anybody writes, except I quite agree with Paul. I agree with Jesus. I agree with my New Testament, but everything else has to be weighed, doesn't it? So lastly, on this issue, I'd like to talk about a book of 2015 by John M.G. Barclay. This book is 656 pages. It's called Paul and the Gift. Now, this book is sort of a bit of an award-winning book. It's been highly regarded. A man who is normally put in the box of being a New Perspective man, and that's Scott McKnight, he highly regards this book. And then a man who is put in the box of the traditional perspective on Paul, Douglas J. Moo, he says this is one of the most important books in years. So it's interesting that this book is recommended by people from both sides, which is why I think you should read it. This book very much summarises Barclay's long journey through Paul, and this book, which also has a great bibliography, I ought to mention that, this book will help you find your own way, because this book almost built a bridge between the two perspectives. There are some areas that Barclay does not agree with the new perspective on. There are some areas that he is persuaded by the new perspective. And what I would say is that this is a book that is just hammering on about grace, the gift of God. He is just hammering on about grace, and he makes that the central point. And I think that it's very interesting to read Barclay's position on this issue. So what am I saying? I'm saying that the new perspective on Paul is not something we should throw out the window. And we certainly should not throw out the traditional perspective either. But it's good that we try to see where both streams of consciousness have come from, and that we try to weigh up before God in the light of his Spirit as to what he is actually saying to us. And Barclay might help you on that, because he definitely finds strengths in both arguments, and he really wants to make out that his suggestion is a better way and that it's a bridge between the two, or possibly, dare I say, a compromise. But Barclay is very good on this. When you've got people from one perspective and the other perspective both recommending this book, then you've really got to read it, haven't you? So, for those of you that have asked me to talk on this subject for 6 months, my apologies for taking my time of getting there. A, I wanted to reread these books, and B, I wanted to check that I fully understood where the new perspective had come from. And so it's taken me a bit of a while to get this together. Plus, of course, there's always these flurry of new books to read that I get terribly excited about and end up videoing them ahead. I have probably been working on this for 6 months, but I've kept sort of putting it down thinking I'm not ready yet, which I think is, when you're a preacher, is a good position to be in, that you know when you're not ready yet. Don't until you are ready, is my advice. But I trust that has helped you a little bit in understanding that the new perspective on Paul is not entirely what it is cracked up to be by the detractors, and that the old perspective, or the traditional perspective on Paul, is not as bad as some of the people who've immediately leapt on the new perspective bandwagon. But when you've got good people like Sanders, like Dunn, like Wright, like McKnight, and a number of other well-known names who are saying something positive about the new perspective, I think it's something that at least we should engage with. If you've benefited from this today, please give me a thumbs up, and please make sure you've subscribed if you haven't done already, and why not leave a comment below. You know, I am very happy that you choose to believe what you've chosen to believe. The role of this channel is not to change what you believe, but it is to promote reading theology, and it's to help you find your way through the mess of incredibly expensive books and only spend money on the ones that you really do need. So if you have any comments to make along that, or indeed if you have got an idea that I can deal with in the next couple of weeks or in the next 6 months, please leave it below, because I am very interested indeed. So until next time, folks, all I've got to say to you is bye!